Hello, hi, welcome to Strawberry Hill presentation with Brian Eversham. I hope everyone out there can hear me. We're doing an online event. We haven't done many of these for a while. We did lots in lockdown, so do forgive us if there's any technical hitches. I can see there's still people arriving. I can't see any of your faces, so we can't get sort of immediate reaction, I'm afraid, but we do have a Q&A button which is at the top. So if everybody has a look at the top bar of your screen, and there should be a Q&A button. If you click that, then you can ask questions throughout this online presentation. And then at the end, I'm going to ask those questions to Brian, and hopefully we'll get through as many of them as we possibly can. But just to let you know what we're going to be doing. So in just a second, I'm going to hand over to Brian, and he's going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Strawberry Hill. And then we've got a couple of videos about Strawberry Hill, and then we'll come back. Brian will tell us a little bit about the future of the site, and then we're going to have a Q&A towards the end. So yes, enjoy this, and I will pass over now to Brian. Here he is. Hello, Brian.
Good evening, Nick. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see people have actually found us. So without further ado, I shall try sharing my screen and running a PowerPoint, which will have two interruptions for videos. So I'm hoping that very shortly you should be seeing my slides. So that's the introductory slide, and probably with a picture of me down in the bottom corner talking to you. And as you can't speak, I can't find out if the 35 of you are listening or not. So that also means if you want to go off and get a cup of strong coffee halfway through, you're very welcome to do so. So structure of the talk this evening is a bit of an introduction based on my very first impressions of Strawberry Hill and setting it in a sort of time context. Then a little bit more detail of the wildlife. Then a video showing the site in all its glory to give you a sense of perspective. Then a fair bit more detail about the wildlife from me, and then a video of Strawberry Hill wildlife, and then finishing off with just a few seconds from me on a forward look about the place and where we hope that it's going. So starting point is to say Strawberry Hill is unusual and unique, and in North Bedfordshire. Those are actually important facts. If you look at the Ordnance Survey map there, Strawberry Hill is a sort of star or diamond shape in the middle. And if you look at the brown contour lines, what you'll see is a pattern familiar to those of you who live in the hilly districts of North Northamptonshire or South Bedfordshire or parts of Cambridgeshire. Ancient woodlands surviving on the deep clay soils of the hilltops, but the valley slopes and most valley bottoms completely lacking in woodland, and probably having been lacking for a couple of thousand years. The feeling is that in eastern and central England, most of the forests were cleared before the Romans colonised Britain. So Strawberry Hill represents an area of scrub and woodland developing in a valley bottom and up the valley sides, which is a feature we've lost for thousands of years in this country. It is surrounded by ancient woodlands, so there's scope for colonisation, and that, plus the quality of the habitats, makes it somewhere very special indeed. If you can see this little timeline, the first important thing about Strawberry Hill is its fame among naturalists in Bedfordshire started in the late 1980s when the whole farm was put effectively into set aside. No management, no farming, just let nature take its course. That's well before sites like Knepp were developed and the phrase rewilding was coined. And that makes Strawberry Hill somewhere very special, and with 35 years of natural regeneration, unlike anywhere else in central England. And at 350 acres, it's big enough that the middle parts of it are pretty much isolated from the influence of surrounding farmland. So it doesn't get the problems of nutrients and spray drift and pesticides that a lot of smaller nature reserves suffer from. I first heard about Strawberry Hill in May 2021 when the site went on the open market for sale, and many members of the Beds Natural History Society and of the Wildlife Trust in Bedfordshire contacted me vigorously saying, this place is so amazing and important, you must save it. So in May 21, I made my first visit to site and very quickly agreed with them and felt it was somewhere really special, really distinctive, unlike anywhere else that I'd looked at. We managed to secure the site in 21-22 with funding provided by philanthropists and a charitable foundation, both of whom actually wanted repaying in due course. So this was essentially an emergency bridging loan to save the site. We spent last year getting to know the site better and getting more and more detailed information about the wildlife, and I'll talk you through that later this evening. And earlier this year, we managed to secure a £1 million grant from BIFA Award to buy the southern half of the site. And we're now well on the way to our £1.5 million total through our current live appeal, which I'll say a little bit more about towards the end of this evening. So walking around the site one sunny May afternoon, and my very first impressions were a place that didn't feel like anywhere else I'd seen before. I was there just about at peak hawthorn blossom, so the site was fragrant, full of flowers, buzzing with insects. Mile upon mile of these wonderful footpaths with scrub, grassland, woodland alongside it, and on a really big scale. So the first thing I noticed, I suppose, was this is bigger than most of our nature reserves. Until this trust started creating really large linked up landscapes like the Great Fen back in the early 2000s, our average nature reserve was 25 acres. This site is 350 acres, so 10, 15 times bigger than your typical fragment of ancient woodland or ancient meadowland. As you walk around it, although you can summarize it as being scrub and grassland, every time you turn a corner, every new stretch of ride feels subtly different. If you walk around with your eyes closed, you notice there are places that are warm and sunny and sheltered, others feel a bit more exposed, some feel quite cool and shady and damp. So a huge site, a diverse site. The abundance of wildlife was the next thing that really struck me. Springtime, the birdsong at this site is louder and more diverse than any other site I've visited, probably since my childhood in Yorkshire. It's really somewhere very special, and that abundance carries on from birds through insects to flowers. Everything you look at happens on a scale and a density that we're not used to. And the more we got to know it, the more we saw that there were scarce species here that made it a very special site. Now, for most of you, the nightingale and the turtle dove and maybe the marbled white butterfly would be the thing that really caught your eye. I have to say the site played a trick on me in that as I was getting out of my car on my very first visit, on the roof of the car was that gorgeous little deadwood beetle, Tenomorphus imperialis, naturally scarce beetle. I'd only ever seen one once before, and my first welcome to Strawberry Hill, even before I set foot on the site, was a deadwood beetle indicating a site with some habitats of long continuity. And as I've got to know the site, I recognise these come from some of the older trees on the site and from some of the ancient hedgerows and green lanes that the site has. But the fame, as I say, really comes down to the nightingales, the turtle doves, the other birds, and to an extent the butterflies, but we'll fill in more of the detail because we now know more about Strawberry Hill than we did when I first saw it. And at this point, I shall pause talking and I'll ask Nick to start the first video, and I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll have a quick visual tour of the site.
Strawberry Hill, a 150-hectare ex-arable farm, has been gradually rewilding since it was taken out of production in 1988. Where there were once ploughed fields, a dense mass of scrub, dominated by hawthorn and blackthorn, has erupted. A scattering of mighty oaks tower over the scrub, a window into the site's agricultural past. Dare to venture into the massive scrub, and you will find that pockets of tussocky grassland and lost ponds cling on, forming a rich mosaic of hidden habitats. You can join our site using the footpaths and bridleways connecting to the hamlets of Notting and Notting Green. You will catch glimpses of our grasslands, recently grazed by our Highland cows, before venturing along corridors of thick scrub, interspersed with a scattering of grassy glades. The central bridleway, running east from the road, is home to a number of our rare scrub-loving birds. Visit in early spring for a chance to hear the remarkable song of the nightingale, with its tropical tones projecting over and above those of our smaller shrubland birds, such as the willow warbler, blackcaps and whitethroats. Our second point of interest is a new path which connects the central public footpath which runs alongside our stream to our east-west bridleway. My volunteers worked hard to open up an old farm track, long ago hidden in the scrub. And in doing so, we have uncovered a flower-rich passage, which at its southern end offers up vast and sprawling views of the scrub at Strawberry Hill. Within the open grasslands and grassy glades found within the scrubby habitats, we've found many wet-loving plants like meadowsweet, wild angelica and common fleabane. But intriguingly, we have also found several plants that are more typical of dry soils, such as common century with its vibrant pink flowers, and yellowwort, typically found in limestone-rich soils. This plant in particular hints at Strawberry Hill's position on the edge of the Yardley-Whittlewood Ridge, a Natural England National Character Area, defined by a ridge of limestone within a sea of clay. Our volunteers have already begun helping us manage the grasslands along the stream. The impact of just one cut can clearly be seen when comparing either side of the path. There is less thatch, fewer dominant grasses, and more space for a diversity of plants to push up through the sward. In summer, butterflies flit about the wet-loving angelica and hempegrimony. Eventually, we hope to replace manual labour with the munching power of cattle on our grasslands. These ecosystem engineers can have a hugely transformative effect on the habitats we have here at Strawberry Hill. Strawberry Hill is crisscrossed with bridleways and public footpaths, many of which have developed a flower-rich edge. These edges attract clouds of familiar butterfly species, such as the meadow brown, ringlet and speckled wood butterflies. The striking black and white marbled whites and small orange skippers can also be seen along our rides. Along the southern and eastern edges of Strawberry Hill, you will notice that the scrub transitions rapidly into secondary woodland. A greater variety of woodland tree species can be found here, including field maple, oak, ash and elm. We believe that rich ancient hedgerows, which adjoin this area, have fed a variety of seeds into the scrub, which now lends itself to a continued natural progression into high forest. I have had the pleasure of introducing many of our staff and volunteers to Strawberry Hill for the first time, and each time I do, I witness the way in which this place invokes feelings of childlike wonder and excitement. Strawberry Hill will be an exercise in patience for many of us involved in its care. But if we are patient and we get things right, I believe the rewards could be revolutionary.
Thanks very much indeed to Chantel, who's been looking after Strawberry Hill for us for a couple of years now and has been willing to actually spend her time also being filmed, even though that's not a natural habitat, so to speak. That, I think, gives you a real flavour of the magic of Strawberry Hill, the scale of it, the diversity of the habitats, and that feeling of somewhere rather special. So I'll now go back to my slides, and hopefully we're now back at the full slide, and I shall move on to introducing you to some of the wildlife that we've been able to discover and to map over the last couple of years as we got to know the site better, and going from the simple wow factor of its area and its overall diversity to some intimate details. Everyone who talks about Strawberry Hill mentions the nightingales. It's a really important population, over 30 pairs breeding, we think. And last year and this year, through the efforts of volunteers, we've been able to map where the singing males of nightingales have been. And this gives you a flavour. The northern half of the site is really very full of nightingales. For reasons we don't quite understand, the southern half has just 1 or 2 pairs on the edge. But that total impact means that anywhere in the northern half of the site, from the beginning of May until the middle of June, wherever you stop, you'll hear nightingales, and very often you'll hear half a dozen or even 20 within earshot. And even from around the buildings in the grassland at the bottom left, you can still hear several nightingales singing throughout that period. Alas, they don't keep going over the whole summer like some songbirds do, because with these guys, as soon as the male's found a mate and she's sitting on eggs, he tends to go very quiet, and from then on, they've got their work cut out feeding their offspring. But it's not just nightingales. If we look at the other warbler species, it gives you a real flavour of the location. So willow warblers declined drastically in southern England over the last 10, 20 years, and yet at Strawberry Hill we still have around 60 singing birds, probably 60 breeding pairs. I can't think of anywhere else in lowland Britain where you get quite this density. As it's scrub rather than fully grown woodland, whitethroats are still doing very well, over 50 pairs each year, and many of these alongside the rides, so as you walk along, your progress is marked by moving from one whitethroat territory to the next. Blackcaps, again, over 40 pairs, scattered across much of the site, and again, higher numbers than I've seen on any other site in central England. And chiffchaffs, which I tend to think of as associated with taller woodland, still pretty abundant. So we've got large numbers of the common species. This is why I talk about bioabundance as well as biodiversity. I think over the last 20 or 30 years, conservationists have been a bit hung up on rare species without bearing in mind that the thing that gives you a real experience of nature is hearing and seeing those species in real plenty. And the total figures for birds are really quite astonishing. Around 250 warbler territories, 6 cuckoos calling at once. The only other place I've heard that in the last 20 years is probably in the Great Fen. We've got nearly all of Bedfordshire's bat species recorded in the last couple of years, including scarce things like barbastelle, which use it as a major thoroughfare between the ancient woodlands. Lyslers and Serotine are heard regularly, and Nathesius pipistrelle, our only migrant bat, is also there. And if you're wondering about that little ball of hay in the middle of the picture on the right hand side, that's a harvest mouse nest, and we found several of those in the grassland as well. My own interests, as some of you may know, have a strong focus on invertebrates, and as soon as I started looking at Strawberry Hill, I started finding things I was not expecting. So bashing around with a sweep net on my first visit, I was turning up species new to Bedfordshire, second county records of other things. The cute little tree hopper at the bottom left with those massive spines on its thorax, that I've seen half a dozen times in my life, but usually single individuals. And on one patch of bramble, I found about 20 of these together. Again, scarce species in abundance, something we weren't expecting. And a sweep net on those hawthorns in blossom time produced bigger numbers of caterpillars than I've ever seen anywhere. These are some of the commoner species that are the dominant ones on that side. Green brindled crescent, a really beautiful marbled caterpillar that often feeds on the blossoms of hawthorn. Again, I've seen 1 or 2 or 3 on other sites. Going out with an ordinary sweep net and bashing the blossoms, I was finding 20 or 30 green brindled crescents in the net together. On one memorable ride, I found over 100 caterpillars in a single set of sweepings. These are the reasons, I think, for that massive density of songbirds. All of those warblers, and also birds like the thrushes, the blue tits, the great tits, will be feeding their young on insect larvae in the main. And species like common quaker and winter moth are the staple fare of woodland and scrub birds in this country. But looking in a bit more detail, wherever I looked, I found things I wasn't expecting. Some of you will know about my current passion about elm trees. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. The bright red so-called fig gall on the elm leaf at the bottom left there is caused by a woolly aphid. That's a reasonably frequent species. I probably find it on a third or a half of the elm trees that I visit. The leaf curl at the top, though, is an aphid gall, which is nationally really quite rare. That's the first Bedfordshire record, only the second or third that I've seen. And I have to say, I've looked at several thousand elm trees in the last 5 years. To say I've only seen that gall twice before is something special. And to make the point that even if you look at fairly obscure wildlife, you find special things at Strawberry Hill, the sort of white collar of fungus on this little stand of Yorkshire fog is a parasitic fungus specific to Yorkshire frog. There are other species of epichloroid feeding on different grass species. This one, again, new to Bedfordshire, and it was the first time I'd found that species. And the elm with the rare gall on turns out to be a peculiar elm. It's a tree called bird elm. It has large bosses, a bit like those on black poplar, if you're familiar with that. It's a straight up tree that forms quite dense thickets. It can grow to 15, 20, 30 metres tall. There are one or two mature trees left on the eastern borders of Strawberry Hill, and it's a small range endemic. Whether it's a valid species or it's a variety of smooth-leaved elm, that's its known distribution. I've looked at elms north, south, east and west of this area and have not found it. So I think that's pretty close to the area of its geographic extent. It's not common here, but in ancient woodlands, you often get strong stands of it. So that was my quick look on my first few days at Strawberry Hill, getting a flavour. This place is as special as naturalists were telling me it was. Its size is reflected in the numbers of things. The diversity is matched by the abundance. But its fame reached out very quickly, so that we found a different sort of volunteer. Graham Lyons is one of the best field entomologists in this country. He knows his spiders and his insects and his mollusks extremely well. Worked for the Sussex Wildlife Trust for about 20 years, and now he's a freelance consultant who makes his living surveying rewilding sites from Knepp through Lincolnshire right up to the Scottish border. And 5 days a week, he's travelling around the country being paid quite well to survey important sites because he's got such a broad breadth of insect and other invertebrate knowledge, he can give you a really good reflection on what the site's like. He heard about Strawberry Hill and was so fascinated. I have to say there's partly the Wildlife Trust and myself sharing it on social media and pushing it as an amazing place, that Graham actually gave up 6 weekends in 2023 to come up to Bedfordshire to volunteer for us, to use his professional skills to give us a professional insight into what the site was really like, using methods that are comparable with the other sites that he's been looking at. So 70 odd rewilding sites, and he was able to look at the Bedfordshire site in that context. And he found lots of exciting things. Several spider species completely new to Bedfordshire, nationally scarce little weevil. If you can make out the bottom left photo, it's actually a sort of cigar-shaped woven case with a little caterpillar inside it that feeds on the leaves of knapweed, of which we have a lot at Strawberry Hill. And I thought I'd put in a few species distribution maps as well. This is partly reflecting my own background in biological recording, but it really helps to put Strawberry Hill in context. So the carrot mining bee, tiny black bee that feeds mainly on wild carrot, you can see that a Bedfordshire record of that, which is not yet on the map, but way up somewhere in here, is a massive northern extension to its geographic range. So this is a southern species found on warm, sunny grassland sites in the south of England, and now also found in Bedfordshire. One of my own records, this little bark louse that lives on lichen-covered hawthorn and willow twigs, is mainly a northern and western species, not particularly well recorded, but again, very interesting to see that ours is the most southeasterly of it, an East Anglian record, but nothing in the Midlands. So again, northern species coming to their southern range limit here at Strawberry Hill. We're very fortunate that Bedfordshire has one of the best lichenologists in Britain working in it, a guy called Mark Powell. Mark spent just one day at Strawberry Hill looking at quite a small area and found several populations of this rather scruffy little grey-green lichen with little blackish fruits. But again, interesting second county record and on the northeastern frontier of the distribution of this mainly southern species. Back to one of Graham's records, this rather attractive and colourful little plant hopper. It's hard to interpret its distribution other than to say it's scattered and it's scarce. So it's found in eastern and southern England up to about Yorkshire, across into mid Wales. No record for Bedfordshire until this one turned up. I'm now making this a little bit more personal and looking at one or two of my own favourites. There's a little brick wall next to the farmhouse garden at the edge of Strawberry Hill. In the moss on that wall, we have a population of the left-hand beast, the so-called bristly millipede. It's an astonishing little animal, as I hope you can see there. It looks to me almost like something you'd expect to be living on a coral reef or possibly in a science fiction novel. Alas, it's only 3 millimeters long, so you're not going to be physically bowled over when one of these pops out, but the fluorescent white tail is actually rather attractive, and I suspect is used for signalling to other bristly millipedes. And some of you may recognise the beast on the right-hand side. It's a tardigrade, and every handful of moss that I looked at from Strawberry had 3 or 4 different tardigrade species in it, including several that I'd never seen before. And one of my newfound passions of the last 5 or 6 years, these gorgeous little objects are the cases of things called testate amoebae. So these are protozoa. The largest species is about a third or a quarter of a millimetre across. So it's a microscope study. But what excited me was that looking in wet moss in the ditches at Strawberry Hill, I found about 6 or 8 species of testate amoebae that I'd never seen before. And I've sampled wet moss in Cambridgeshire and Norfolk and Suffolk and Yorkshire and Scotland. So Strawberry Hill has something special going for it. Now, if you walk around the site at this time of year, particularly if you look at that new ride which Chantal's volunteers have created, one of the commonest flowers at this time of year is this gorgeous little thing, a sort of beautiful little amethyst pea flower called slender tear. And the nice thing about this is that the map shows a Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire focus. Strawberry Hill is just about here. So if you can see my arrow pointing, Strawberry Hill is on the edge of its main modern range. Note the colour coding. All the pale blue records are old records, and there are only a few dozen modern 10-kilometre squares where this species is recorded. So nationally scarce, rapidly declining, and if you look on the ecological accounts of the species, it describes Strawberry Hill perfectly. It's a grassland species, often found on the edge of scrub, on clay soils which are wet and waterlogged in winter and baked hot and dry in the summer. And that's a perfect description of what you see as you walk around Strawberry Hill. So I hope that's given you a flavour of some of the interesting species and the very fact that whatever sort of wildlife you like best, you will find something interesting and unusual and different at Strawberry Hill. And to reinforce that message, we'll now take a short break for another little video. So we'll have a look at some more wildlife almost in the flesh, and I'll stop sharing screen and Nick will hand us over to that. I hope that gives you a flavour of what Strawberry Hill feels and sounds like. There is something really special there. As I was playing, it occurred to me that most of these birds and flowers are things which naturalists wouldn't describe as internationally or nationally rare, but they're things we just don't see anymore. And so many people I've shown around Strawberry Hill said it feels like going back in time. There's a sense it's almost like what Victorians wrote about, clouds of butterflies, meeting literally hundreds of butterflies in one place. Birdsong almost loud enough to keep you awake at night or to deafen you. That's not something we experience these days very often. And Strawberry Hill, for me, is special because of that density as well as its diversity. So we'll go back to a few more slides and I'll say just a little bit about the potential future for Strawberry Hill and think about where we go next. So you've had a look at the slide. If you notice that row of willow trees, by the way, it's worth saying that the central stream and the wetlands associated with it bring in quite a lot more diverse habitats, and there are lots of species associated with that, hence the damselfly and lots of species of dragonfly damselfly around the site, breeding on site and foraging in the scrub and the grassland. I spent quite a lot of my time over the last couple of years introducing people to the site, and we've been very fortunate that it's already gained a reputation that attracts people. So we've here got third from left, Craig Bennett, the National Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust. And I should say the Royal Society of Wildlife Trust has been incredibly supportive of us in raising the profile of the site and advertising the appeal and the need for funds to their wider membership. And from that, we've actually had donations coming from Wales and Northern England and the Southwest and all over the place. Centre stage there is Tony Juniper, Chairman of Natural England, Barbara Young, our own patron, and around there, many of the leading scientists in Natural England. So we've got serious visitors coming to look at the site, partly because they've heard of it and they're just curious, partly because they recognise that a site as big as this, 350 acres of completely naturally regenerating scrub and grassland on ex-arable, can start answering some important scientific questions. So just to detour very slightly from wildlife to wider environmental issues. Arable land stores very little carbon in the soil, and all the growing plant material on arable will be cut down and harvested or will decompose in a short space of time. So arable land stores very little carbon. Apologies for those who don't like graphs, but this shows you how woodlands store carbon over time. Sequestration is how much they're taking in per unit time. So the orange line is carbon capture per hectare or acre of woodland per year, and the blue line is the total amount stored within the wood over a timescale of 200 years. So peak carbon capture in woodland is somewhere around 20 to 30 years when trees are growing very vigorously, and thereafter the accumulation of carbon gets somewhat slower, and the blue line starts leveling out after something like a century, so that the first 100 years there's a lot of carbon added to the stock, and thereafter it plateaus out, so that after about 200 years it's reached peak carbon storage. Because people grow trees as a crop, because the carbon content of wood is an important measure, scientists have been quantifying carbon storage in trees for a very long time. Sadly, we've not paid as much attention to the carbon stored in other habitats. This is Porto Meadow near Huntingdon, by the way, one of our largest lowland floodplains. And researchers at the Open University have been looking at carbon capture and storage in wet grasslands. Now, in woodlands, we think of most of the carbon as being embodied in the trees, and woodland soil relatively shallow and relatively low carbon. Some of these wet grasslands store carbon right down to 3, 4, 5, even 7 meters deep. Some of these grassland plants have very deep penetrating roots, and the latest research is hinting that wet grasslands may store about the same amount of carbon as mature woodland. So we're getting evidence that the grasslands on a site like Strawberry Hill may be an important carbon store. So far, there's even less information about carbon storage in scrub. And I've thrown the idea around and talked to a few carbon scientists about this. It's possible that the combination of very rich soil carbon in grassland and quite a volume of above ground carbon in scrub that may be 10, 20, 30 years old, this could actually be the peak carbon for any habitat. And as the scrub grows and closes over, this is actually secondary woodland at Camborne, and not bad woodland, but this 200-year-old bit of woodland is only just reaching the stage where the trees are mature enough to start falling down of their own accord, creating dead wood and clearings and glades. And what you notice in most woodlands by high summer is there's virtually no ground level vegetation. So the grassland communities and the soil carbon captured by grassland plants will have dissipated by the time the canopy is closed over. And not wishing to be too offensive and rude to secondary woodlands around our patch, but there's a sense in which the scrub full of songbirds, full of nightingales, several pairs of turtle doves and the rest of it, may be peak biodiversity for a very long time to come. Leave it untouched and the scrub turns into tall secondary woodland. It shades out most of the flowers. Without flowers and nectar sources, we lose most of the insects. And secondary woodland, I tend to feel, is a potentially rather dull habitat for its first 150 to 200 years. Now, some of you will have read the work of Oliver Rackham, the great ecological historian of Cambridge and indeed of lowland British woodlands. And Rackham said something interesting and typically provocative, that what was wrong with young woodlands in Britain is the lack of straight-tusked elephants. The present interglacial is the only interglacial when Northern Europe has not had one or more species of elephant. And the great thing about elephants is their ability to fell and to demolish mature, healthy trees. They're also very big and heavy grazing animals. So elephants moving into a woodland would clear some of the trees. They and other grazing animals would maintain open areas. So the future of Strawberry Hill probably involves some grazing. Alas, I don't think the Trust's likely to have the money or the technology to bring back straight-tusked elephants, even if we thought it was a good idea. But what we can do is bring in Highland cattle or Longhorn cattle, often with tracking collars, so we can get them to graze where we want without having to fence the site. And Highland cattle will certainly keep grasslands open and have quite an impact on the scrub itself to maintain those more open areas and keep the scrub where it currently stands. They won't take down large developing trees, so that if we wanted to have maximum structural diversity, then frankly our alternative to elephants is actually staff and volunteers with chainsaws who are capable of taking down mature trees. And my current vision for the future management of Strawberry Hill is to think of it in three parts. The southern third is already a bit more advanced. Some of that had had some tree planting done on it in the 1970s. That is an area to leave to mature as secondary woodland. So over 100 acres will be non-intervention secondary woodland, just to see what happens and find out if I'm right, that it does become a little bit less interesting for a century or so. The site's big enough, we can carry out that experiment. That will also be a natural experiment to see how natural regeneration stores carbon over the first 30, 50, 100 years. The middle section of the site, I expect to be grazed by cattle, perhaps also by sheep. For the Wildlife Trust's perspective, one of the benefits of Strawberry Hill is it's almost the geographic centre of our three counties. And as the sheep commutes, it's only about 10 miles from our Nen Valley sites where we use sheep for grazing, but occasionally the sites get flooded quite rapidly, particularly in winter. And it's good to have so-called layback land where we can put those sheep in an emergency if we need to. It's an open question as to whether the livestock component should also have some sort of ancient breed pigs among it, thinking things like Tamworths. If any of you visited Knepp in Sussex, Knepp is a rewilding site that's about 10 years younger than Strawberry Hill, and Knepp was going into that rather dull dense scrub turning into secondary woodland stage until they brought in Tamworth pigs. And those pigs have revitalised the site. They've created new bare soil. That's brought in more colonising plants. And the ecology of Knepp's transformed by having those semi-wild pigs on site. And Tamworths are relatively people-friendly as well. So a site with public rights of way, you don't have to worry too much. And then the northern third of the site, my sense is we may need a little bit more of these artificial straight-tusked elephants. We'll need the volunteers with chainsaws to maintain larger rides and glades, scalloped edges to some of the rides, to create more of that interface. So much ecology happens where habitats meet. So maintaining the maximum edges between grass and low scrub and high scrub and incipient woodland will maximise biodiversity and abundance and keep the current flavour of Strawberry Hill on a permanent basis. The lovely thing about a site of 350 acres is that each of those three management types can be extensive enough. There's a big chunk in the middle, almost insulated from the surrounding landscapes, and so not affected by most of the agricultural chemicals that affect most of our small sites. If you don't know what I'm talking about, next time you go for a walk in a small wood, just look at the ground floor and see where you can spot nettles and goosegrass. They're both plants that like high nutrient levels, and you will tend to find there's a 50-metre band around the edge of most of our woods where there's so much nutrient coming in from the farmland that the normal woodland ground floor of things like bluebells and dog's mercury is replaced by stinging nettles and by goosegrass where there's that nutrient level. And on a lot of small sites, a 50-metre belt takes out the bulk of the site, and you don't have much centre that's free from that. Strawberry Hill's so big that you can almost forget the outside edge and concentrate on studying the ecology, the natural history, and the processes of that central area. So that was a very brief and very quick introduction. Nothing can replace visiting the site and seeing it for yourself. So those of you who are booked on to come to our annual general meeting in October, I hope we'll get a chance to see Strawberry Hill face to face. There is a network of public footpaths, so park at the end of one of those paths and walk in sometime, and watch our website, because I'm sure we'll be running quite a lot of open days and events and guided walks there. There's a lot of wildlife to see. Whatever your personal passion, you can find something at Strawberry Hill to satisfy it. So that's enough from me. I will now stop screen sharing, and Nick will see if any of you have asked any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brian. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions, but if anyone else wants to ask questions, if you click on the button, the Q&A button at the top, and pop your question in there. I don't think your name comes through, so if you want to read out your name, then just put your name at the bottom of your comment. So first one is from Aidan Whitfield, Butterfly Conservation, Beds in Northants branch, but it's not a question about butterflies, it's about hydrology. So he's saying, I assume the site was drained using field drains of Victorian times. Are there any plans to reverse this and hold more water on site, especially in the winter?
Sort of. The idea of storing more water on site, I think, is an interesting one and quite important. And it's occurred to us that that central stream, which flows, although the site's covered in boulder clay, the stream moves fast enough that over the decades it's eroded away, washed away the clay and left a gravelly bottom, including quite a lot of chalk and flint. So although it's not on pure chalk, it has the flavour of a rather spatey, summer dry chalk stream. There are a couple of largish ponds in the valley already which do stay wet all year round, so we've got things like breeding stoneflies and dragonflies and damselflies there. It would be relatively straightforward to dam that central stream in 3 or 4 places and create a sort of cascade of small ponds or large ponds or small lakes as you go down there. And I think that would be well worth doing. You're quite right that the fields would have been underdrained in the Victorian period. The story from the farmer who was farming it from the 1950s to the 1980s was that it was a very unproductive farm, very heavy clay soil and very difficult to farm and make a profit. Incidentally, that's precisely the story that you hear from the Knepp estate in Sussex, that they were trying hard in a variety of different ways to make Knepp a profitable arable farm. And frankly, they failed. They couldn't find a business that would work. So stopping farming, growing wildlife and charging visitors for the experience has become a much more lucrative business for Knepp than trying against all odds to make a profitable farm. So my guess is that although the field drains may have been there, they've not been hugely effective. And I don't think we need to do a great deal. The site does get remarkably wet. This last winter, obviously, one of the wettest we've ever seen. Quite large parts of the site, you really needed wellies rather than boots, or you'd have actually got very wet feet.
Excellent. Well, that does lead on to the next question, which is, are you considering having beavers on the site to help with tree felling and to bring back wetter areas?
They would be a great way to make those dams to create that series of ponds down the Central Valley. Strawberry Hill at the moment probably has about space for 2 or 3 beavers maximum. And from previous legislation, if you wanted to release beavers on site, you'd have to fence them. I'm not convinced we'd want to spend tens of thousands of pounds putting up a fence to contain a pair of beavers if we could achieve the same management work without them. But we are introducing beavers into the Nen Valley, only half a dozen miles from Strawberry Hill. They will be in a large fenced area. And beavers being beavers, there will probably be lots of small beavers in a few years' time. And if we needed some, we will have a ready supply. I'm seriously hopeful that the new government will think carefully about beavers fitting into the landscape. Read the studies that demonstrate beavers are really good for reducing flooding downstream. They're great for biodiversity. My own personal view is that they're also creating shallow water, which is amazing breeding grounds for coarse fish. And I'd like to think that Britain's angling community will get on side with this and think that actually having beavers in most river catchments will create the breeding ground to boost the fish stocks, which in most of our lowland rivers are really doing badly at the moment. So I would love there to be beavers at Strawberry Hill. I'd rather they were unfenced beavers that walk where they choose. The Central Valley is big enough, as I say, to probably have one breeding pair. We may have to start moving animals around into the bigger river valleys afterwards. So I'd rather do that when an enlightened modern government has decided beavers belong in Britain and all our river valleys should have beavers within them.
Well, sadly, it wasn't mentioned in the King's speech today, I'm afraid. So not a top priority, but let's keep our fingers crossed. I think you mentioned pretty much every species. You went right down to amoeba, but you didn't mention reptiles. So question here, have any been recorded?
I think we've got grass snakes and common lizards. I certainly heard rustlings in dry grassland that sounded like common lizards. I've not actually seen any amphibians myself, but I'd be very surprised if we don't have common frog, probably common. Oh, we've definitely got great crested newt and smooth newt in the ponds. I should say there are 6 small ponds around the site as well. Not aware of any records of adders or slowworms, which are just about possible in that part of Bedfordshire. So get out there and keep your eyes open.
Okay. Right, I'm just going to read this one out so I haven't had a chance to read it. So, lovely flood meadow at Huntingdon. Can you explain where this 7-metre deep carbon storage comes from, as I would expect the soil to be silt and clay, and any carbon is removed when the grass is cut?
The basic story is a lot of floodplain plants have far, far deeper root systems than people ever thought. This is new research in the last couple of years from the Open University. Professor David Going's been leading on it, and they've actually been following down the organic material into the soil, and it's stored within the root mass of the wet grassland plants. So new work not been done before. They've just got a new grant to repeat it in half a dozen more river catchments to see what the averages are. It may be that central England, being relatively dry and warm in summer and relatively wet in winter, has a slightly different pattern from others. But the basic message is grassland plants are very deep rooted. Those roots contain a lot of carbon. Oh, and the other thing to say is that compared with woodland, the grassland is solid vegetation, whereas woodlands have a lot of carbon in a tree and then quite a big gap until the next tree. And the root mass underground is relatively shallow, assuming that these recent research findings about grasslands are confirmed more widely.
Excellent. Okay, lots more research to be done there, obviously. So Terry and Judy Wood have asked, how will you limit the disturbance regarding sensitive species, nightingales and turtle doves in particular, and will dogs be limited to public rights of way only?
Simple answer to the last one is yes, I hope so. As there is a network of public paths, we can't prevent dogs on those. We can advise people to keep dogs on leads. The law usually says under close control, which is one of those rather difficult, vague phrases. And you may have noticed on a lot of our reserves over the last year, we've actually changed our signage to say, particularly during the bird breeding season, please keep dogs on leads. It's a simpler message than saying close control and on a lead if you need livestock. Just simplify it and say everywhere dogs on leads. I think the benefit of Strawberry Hill is the Apparently, dense, impenetrable tangle of scrub will mean a lot of dog owners will not want to let their dogs wander too far for fear of losing them. So my hope is that in the same way as nettles and brambles are great ways of controlling the passage of people across sites, that thought that you've got this huge area of tangled scrub where your animal could go and get lost might be enough to persuade most people to keep their animals on their path on a lead. So far, I have to say, apart from early morning local walks, I'm not seeing huge numbers of dog walkers at Strawberry Hill. Partly the reason I suspect is that there's not very good parking. And as we develop visitor facilities and we develop parking, then I think as we don't have a large population of long distance dog walkers, we can manage that issue before it arises. Those who have been involved with the trust for a long time will be aware there are quite a few sites where if we had a complete free hand, we may decide not to have dogs over most of the site. But because the site was already heavily used by dog walkers by the time we acquired it, it's really difficult to persuade people to stop doing what they believe they've got a right to do.
Okay, that kind of leads on to the next question as well, which is about to what extent will the general public eventually be allowed to access over and above the current footpath network, which anyone can access at the moment, and will there be some sort of visitor centre in the future?
The footpath one, I don't think there'll be much access away from the paths for to be generally encouraged. I mean, if naturalists want to go exploring in the scrub, then I think if they're going to give us their records, then that's a really good thing. We would encourage that. For the general public, the network of paths is diverse enough and extensive enough. I've not measured it, but it must be something like 8 or 10 miles worth. I think that's more than enough for most people. So I don't think I'd be looking to create many more paths or encouraging people to wander off the paths, partly because if we've got grazing stock there, we don't want people, even without dogs, bumping into Highland cattle, Longhorn cattle in the middle of dense scrub where they may surprise each other. The visitor centre idea is a nice one, and I have to say Strawberry Hill's been a difficult and a different place for us to fundraise for compared with anything I've done before. We've not had a lottery grant to support this site, as we have done on many recent purchases for a variety of reasons. And the informal advice from the lottery director was to say, take it one step at a time and see what happens.
For the appeal, so I'll leave you to answer that last question and then make a final, give everyone a good reason why they should go and follow this link and can donate to our current appeal, our largest appeal ever. Thank you very much.
So 350 acres of scrub can have created within it 6 or 8 or 10 little glades, 10, 20 meters across, the perfect place to run forest schools and to train teachers in how to run forest schools. If you don't know about it, forest schools are an amazing teaching method where kids who struggle in the classroom, maybe disturbed teenagers, youngsters who've had problems when they change schools or difficulty in maintaining their attention, you take them to an outdoor learning space, and in the course of half a dozen sessions, you can transform their abilities, their self-confidence, and their performance in school. I'd love Strawberry Hill to be a regional or national centre for forest school training, and we can do that without impacting on the wildlife. It's big enough to accommodate lots of different uses like that. So we have on our patch the biggest area of immensely wildlife-rich scrub in central England. We've saved the southern half. The northern half is a place with most of the nightingales. Do come along and see it for yourself. Do come along next spring and enjoy the nightingales. And think about, if we wanted to create a site like this, it'd take us at least 35 years. Here, that 35 years of hard work of doing nothing has happened already. It's a small miracle. Well, it's actually a 350 acre miracle, a magical place with so much wildlife in every group you look at. It's a great place just to go and walk and think. I've had some lovely days there. I've seen people of all ages. I've seen an 85-year-old hear her first nightingale, and the look of joy, the tears welling up in the eye to hear their first nightingale, something they thought they may never do. And you can do that at Strawberry Hill within 5 or 10 yards of your car. That's the place we're trying to save. And if that isn't enough to make you feel you want to help us save Strawberry Hill, I'm very surprised you survived till the end of this talk. So thank you for listening. And if you're still with us, if you're able to donate however much or however little, every bit helps. And for future fundraising, the more local people have given, the stronger our ask when we go to lottery for money for that small visitor centre or for building restoration. So give what you can and do keep in touch with us. Thanks ever so much for listening tonight.